10 enemy fighters swarm a lone Allied reconnaissance plane over hostile territory. The crew braces for the kill shot, fingers white-knuckled on their guns. Every instinct screams to push the throttle forward, to dive, to run. But the pilot does the unthinkable. He throttles down, bleeding speed until the aircraft shudders at the edge of a stall. The enemy formation, screaming in at attack speed, overshoots in a cascade of confusion. Their tight formation explodes into chaos, fighters peeling away in all directions as their momentum betrays them. The sky reeks of aviation fuel and scorched metal. Intelligence officers lose sleep over the attrition rates. Pilots are being chewed up faster than replacements can be trained. In this crucible of speed and aggression, where aces are crowned by kill counts and raw nerve, one pilot doesn't fit the mold. Philip Kent stands tall and thin in his flight gear, wire-rimmed glasses perpetually fogging in the cockpit humidity. An MIT graduate who speaks in measured, calculated sentences, Kent earned the nickname the Bookworm for all the wrong reasons. While other pilots play poker and swap combat stories, Kent pores over technical manuals, studies translated enemy flight doctrine, and fills notebooks with fuel burn calculations and energy state diagrams. His civil engineering background taught him to see forces and vectors where others see only sky and steel. The brass considers him too odd to promote, brilliant, yes, but lacking the killer instinct that separates the living from the dead at 20,000 feet. His overanalytical nature is deemed dangerous, a liability in split-second combat where hesitation kills. So Kent does what the overlooked always do. He builds his own crew. A navigator who once swam 5 miles through freezing water after being shot down. A gunner busted down from his previous squadron for insubordination. Misfits and cast-offs, every one. Men dismissed by the system but hungry to prove their worth. Together, they volunteer for the missions no one else wants. Unescorted photo reconnaissance runs deep into enemy airspace, mapping installations and airfields where fighters swarm like hornets. The kind of missions where the odds are simple and brutal, every sortie costs machines and men. But Kent believes something the aces don't, that precision matters more than speed. That physics, properly understood, can turn a disadvantage into a weapon. That a slower plane, flown by a thinking pilot, might survive what a faster one cannot. He's about to prove it against 10 enemy fighters who are faster, more agile, and absolutely certain they have him cornered. Kent never wanted to be a pilot. At MIT, he'd spent 4 years learning how bridges stay up, how forces distribute through steel and concrete, how to calculate load-bearing capacity down to the decimal point. His professors praised his methodical mind, the way he triple-checked every calculation before committing pencil to paper. Measure thrice, cut once, his engineering mentor used to say, and Kent had taken it as gospel. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and the gospel changed. Suddenly, the nation needed bodies in cockpits more than it needed careful engineers building roads that wouldn't exist if the war was lost. Kent enlisted, figuring his understanding of physics and structural mechanics might give him an edge in understanding aircraft systems. He wasn't wrong, but he hadn't anticipated how much the military would resent him for it. Flight school revealed the divide immediately. The other cadets were natural athletes, men who'd grown up hunting or racing cars, who trusted their reflexes and flew by feel. They'd pull back the stick and bank into turns without thinking about airflow over the wings or the relationship between speed and lift. It worked for them. Instinct kept them alive in the chaos of a dogfight. Kent couldn't do it. Every maneuver triggered a cascade of calculations in his mind. Angle of attack, airspeed, engine temperature, fuel consumption, G-forces on the airframe. He'd freeze for half a second, running the numbers, and his instructors would scream through the radio that hesitation kills, that he needed to trust his gut, that overthinking would get him and his crew killed. But Kent's gut told him nothing useful. His training told him everything. He knew exactly how much stress the wings could take before metal fatigue became critical. He knew the stall speed in a dozen different configurations. He knew that enemy fighters, built lighter and faster, had advantages in acceleration but disadvantages in energy retention during extended maneuvers. None of this made him faster or more aggressive, so his flight scores remained adequate but uninspiring, good enough to graduate, not good enough to impress anyone. By the time he reached his operational squadron in 1944, his reputation had preceded him. The professor, they called him, with a mix of amusement and contempt. While other pilots relied on combat reports and verbal debriefings, Kent obsessively studied captured enemy aircraft manuals, translated tactical documents, and performance specifications. He filled notebooks with comparative analyses, charts plotting turn radius versus speed, diagrams showing pursuit curves and deflection angles. His squadron mates thought he was preparing for a test that would never come. They were wrong. Kent was preparing for the one test that mattered: survival against an enemy that was faster, more experienced, and absolutely certain of victory. He just needed the numbers to prove it was possible. The briefing room stank of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, but nobody noticed anymore. They were too busy studying the map on the wall, where red pins marked the locations of downed aircraft. There were more red pins than blue ones now, and the blue pins, the ones marking successful returns, were clustered disturbingly close to base. Nobody was making it deep into enemy territory and coming back. Kent sat in the back row, listening to the intelligence officer recite the week's losses with the flat monotone of a man who'd stopped feeling anything months ago. 8 reconnaissance planes, 6 heavy bombers, 11 fighters on escort duty. The math was simple and devastating. They were losing aircraft faster than factories could build them, losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them. The doctrine was killing them. Speed and altitude. That was the gospel handed down from command. Fly high enough to avoid flak, fly fast enough to outrun interceptors, and if you get bounced, dive for speed and head for home. It had worked in the early days of the war, when Allied planes had advantages in raw power and the enemy was still learning. But 1943 had changed everything. The enemy had adapted. Their fighters were lighter, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots who'd been in combat since the war's first days. They'd learned to anticipate the dive, to position themselves below and ahead, turning the standard escape maneuver into a killing funnel. And the vaunted altitude advantage? Enemy fighters could climb faster than the heavy reconnaissance planes could, reaching optimal attack position before the bombers even knew they were being hunted. Kent had watched it happen twice. The first time, he'd been part of a 6-plane formation on a mapping run. They'd maintained altitude and speed exactly as briefed. The enemy fighters had come out of the sun, ripped through the formation like sharks through a school of fish, and vanished before anyone could get a decent firing solution. 3 planes went down. The second time, he'd seen a bomber try the standard diving escape. The enemy fighters had simply followed the dive, using their superior agility to stay in firing position, shredding the bomber's tail section until it tumbled out of control. The intelligence officer finished his recitation and opened the floor for questions. Nobody asked any. There was nothing to ask. The doctrine wasn't working, but command wouldn't change it. Too much institutional momentum, too many careers built on the assumption that Allied planes were superior. Admitting the doctrine was flawed meant admitting they'd been sending men to die for strategies that stopped working months ago. Kent opened his notebook and started sketching pursuit curves, calculating closure rates and energy states. Somewhere in the physics, there had to be an answer. There had to be a way to turn the enemy's advantages into liabilities. He just hadn't found it yet. Kent found his navigator in the hospital ward, 3 days after the man had been fished out of the North Sea. Lieutenant Marcus Webb sat upright in his bed, wrapped in blankets despite the ward's oppressive heat, staring at nothing. His plane had gone down 40 miles from the coast. The rest of the crew had died in the initial attack. Webb had swum for 5 miles through freezing water before hypothermia started shutting down his brain, then swam 3 more miles on nothing but spite and the refusal to let the ocean finish what the enemy had started. A fishing trawler had spotted him a quarter-mile from shore, more corpse than man. The doctors said he'd never fly again. Too much trauma, too much time in the cold. His hands still shook when he tried to hold a pencil. Command was processing his medical discharge. Kent sat down beside the bed and showed him a navigation chart covered in his own handwriting. Fuel calculations, wind drift compensations, optimal photo run altitudes that balanced reconnaissance requirements against fighter interception probability. Webb studied the chart for 3 minutes without speaking, then looked up at Kent with eyes that had stopped being dead. "You're serious," Webb said. "I need someone who knows what it takes to survive when everything goes wrong," Kent replied. Webb reported for duty 2 days later. The tail gunner took longer to recruit. Sergeant Raymond Cole had been busted down from his previous squadron for insubordination, specifically for punching his pilot in the face after the man had abandoned a crippled wingman to save his own skin. Cole had spent 2 weeks in the stockade and was now assigned to ground maintenance, his flying career effectively over. Kent found him in the hangar, methodically cleaning a 50 caliber machine gun that probably didn't need cleaning. Cole was built like a boxer, compact and coiled, with hands that moved over the weapon's components with the careful precision of a man who understood that details meant the difference between life and death. "I hear you broke formation protocol," Kent said. Cole didn't look up. "I hear you're the guy who reads manuals instead of flying. I need a gunner who thinks about firing solutions instead of just pulling triggers. I need a pilot who won't cut and run when things get bad." "I've never left a wingman," Kent said, "and I'm not planning to start." Cole looked up then, measuring Kent with the flat gaze of someone who'd learned not to trust easy promises. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he set down the machine gun and stood. "When do we fly?" Kent assembled the rest of his crew the same way, men the system had written off, men with too many questions or not enough political sense, men who'd proven they could survive when survival meant doing something other than following doctrine. By the end of the week, he had a full crew of misfits, cast-offs, and insubordinates. They were exactly what he needed. Kent spread the captured enemy fighter manual across the table in the ready room, his finger tracing a column of performance specifications. Webb stood beside him, still learning to read Kent's shorthand notations that covered every margin. "Look at this," Kent said, tapping the page. "Maximum speed, 400 miles per hour. Rate of climb, 3,000 feet per minute. Turn radius at combat speed, 800 feet. Webb studied the numbers. "They are faster than us in every category." "Exactly." Kent pulled out his own notebook, flipping to a page dense with equations. "And that's the problem everyone fixates on. Speed, agility, rate of climb. We try to match them in categories where we can't win." He drew a simple diagram. 2 aircraft, one pursuing the other. Standard pursuit doctrine assumes constant velocity. The attacking fighter closes at maximum speed, achieves firing position, takes the shot. It works perfectly if the target maintains speed and heading, which is what doctrine tells us to do, Webb said. "Maximum speed, maximum altitude." Kent nodded. "Now watch what happens when we change one variable." He drew a second diagram, this time showing the target aircraft suddenly decelerating. The enemy fighter is traveling at 400 miles per hour. Call it 600 feet per second. He's committed to the attack run, focused on lead calculation and deflection angles. His finger is on the trigger. Webb leaned closer, following Kent's pencil as it sketched the geometry. Suddenly, we throttled down. Hard. We bleed 50 miles per hour in 3 seconds. The enemy fighter doesn't just overshoot. He has to overshoot. Physics won't let him do anything else. Kent's pencil traced the arc of the enemy fighter screaming past the suddenly slower target. Momentum equals mass times velocity. His aircraft is lighter than ours, but is carrying significantly more velocity. That momentum has to go somewhere. He can't adjust fast enough, Webb said, understanding dawning in his voice. Worse than that, if he tries to adjust, if he pulls hard on the stick to stay in firing position, he'll either stall out or overstress his airframe. The tighter he turns, the more speed he loses, and the more his energy state collapses. And if there are multiple fighters in formation. Kent drew several aircraft, their neat attack pattern dissolving into chaos. They are all calibrated for the same closing speed. When we suddenly aren't where we're supposed to be, their formation geometry fails. They have to break apart to avoid colliding with each other. Webb stared at the diagrams, then looked up at Kent. You want to slow down in the middle of an attack. I want to use their speed against them, Kent said. Make their advantage into a liability. Command will never approve this. Kent closed his notebook. Command doesn't need to know until it works. The mission briefing appeared on the board at 0600. Photo reconnaissance of enemy airfield installations 200 miles inside hostile territory. No escort fighters available. Expected enemy interceptor activity, heavy. Volunteer crews only. Nobody volunteered. The intelligence officer stood at the front of the briefing room for 10 minutes, waiting, while pilots studied their boots or suddenly found their coffee fascinating. This wasn't cowardice. This was mathematics. Unescorted reconnaissance that deep into enemy airspace wasn't a mission, it was a funeral with paperwork. Kent raised his hand. The intelligence officer blinked, clearly surprised anyone had responded at all, then nodded and dismissed the briefing. Kent's crew gathered around the mission map after everyone else had filed out. Webb traced the flight path with one finger, his hand steadier now than it had been 2 weeks ago. 200 miles in. Same distance back. 400 miles total over enemy territory. Webb's voice was flat, factual. Average interception time is 18 minutes after crossing the line. We'll be in their airspace for 90 minutes minimum. Cole crossed his arms, studying the map with the expression of a man calculating odds he didn't like. How many fighters are we expecting? Intelligence estimates between 6 and 12, Kent said, based on observed patrol patterns around the target area. 12. Cole let out a slow breath. Against one plane. Against one plane that they think will run. Kent pulled out his notebook, showing them the diagrams he'd refined over the past week. They'll come in fast, expecting us to dive or try to outrun them. Standard pursuit geometry. When we throttle down instead, their formation breaks. We create angles for you and the waist gunners. Webb studied the calculations, his engineer's mind working through the variables. The margin for error is thin. If your timing is off by even a few seconds. I know. Kent met his navigator's eyes. I've run the numbers 40 times. It works, but I need you to trust the math. Math doesn't account for everything, Cole said. What happens if one of their pilots figures out what you're doing and adapts? Then we adapt faster. Kent closed the notebook. Look, I'm not ordering anyone to fly this mission. Command wants volunteers because they know what they are asking. If any of you want to walk away, do it now. No shame, no questions. Nobody moved. Webb and Cole exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then Cole shrugged. I didn't survive the stockade to die doing something boring, Cole said. Webb nodded slowly. I swam 8 miles through freezing water. I can handle 90 minutes of terror. The rest of the crew murmured agreement. Kent looked at each of them in turn. Men who'd been written off, who'd survived when survival seemed impossible, who understood that sometimes the smart move looked like insanity. Wheels up at 0800, Kent said. Get some rest. Tomorrow we're going to prove that physics beats aggression. None of them slept. They crossed into enemy territory at 0930, climbing to 12,000 feet through scattered cloud cover. Kent kept his hands steady on the controls, watching the fuel gauges and engine temperatures with the same methodical attention he'd give to a training flight. Webb called out navigation checkpoints in a calm voice that betrayed nothing. The sky stayed empty for 40 minutes. Then Cole's voice cracked through the intercom. "Contacts. High and behind. I count 10. No, wait, 10 confirmed." Kent felt his pulse kick up but kept his voice level. "Distance. 4 miles and closing fast. They've seen us." Webb leaned over his charts, pencil moving across the map. "We 3 minutes from the target area. Photo run will take 90 seconds. Kent did the math instantly. The enemy fighters would be in firing range in less than 2 minutes. Standard doctrine said break off, dive for speed, run for home. Every instinct screamed to bank hard and get out while they still could. "Maintain course," Kent said. Cole's voice was tight. "They're coming in fast. Formation attack, high quarter approach. 2 minutes." The target area materialized ahead. 3 airfields arranged in a triangle, revetments visible even from altitude. Webb moved to the camera controls, adjusting angles and checking film advance. The entire crew understood what was happening. Kent was gambling that the enemy fighters would expect them to run, that they positioned for a pursuit rather than a direct head-on engagement. 1 minute to firing range, Cole reported. "They are not breaking formation. Clean attack run." Kent watched the airfields grow larger. His mouth was dry but his hands remained steady. The physics was sound. The math was right. He just had to trust it. "Target area in 30 seconds, Webb said. I pressed to the camera viewfinder. "They're in range." Cole's voice carried an edge now. "Any second they're going to light us up." The enemy fighters held their formation, clearly expecting Kent to break and run. They were positioning for a high-speed pursuit, probably already calculating deflection angles for a diving target. Kent could see them now, 10 dark shapes against the blue sky, their formation tight and professional. "Beginning photo run," Webb said. The camera began its mechanical clicking. 15 seconds. 20. The enemy fighters closed to 3,000 feet, then 2,000. Kent could make out individual aircraft details now. They weren't firing yet, too confident, too certain their target would break. "Photo run complete," Webb said. "Execute," Kent said, and pulled the throttle back. The engine noise dropped to a guttering roar. The airspeed indicator began falling, 200 miles per hour, 190, 180. The aircraft shuddered as it approached stall speed. Behind them, 10 enemy fighters screamed forward at attack velocity, their firing solutions suddenly meaningless as their target vanished from where physics said it should be. The first enemy fighter shot past Kent's canopy at 400 miles per hour, close enough that he could see the pilot's face twisted in confusion. The fighter's guns hadn't fired, couldn't fire, because Kent's aircraft was no longer where every calculation said it should be. The second and third fighters followed, their formation geometry collapsing as they tried to process what had just happened. One pulled hard left, the other banked right, their wingtips missing each other by less than 20 feet. The tight attack formation that had looked so lethal 5 seconds ago was now 10 individual aircraft scattered across 1,000 feet of sky, each pilot fighting his own momentum. "They're breaking," Cole shouted, and Kent heard the hammering of the tail gun as his gunner found targets in the chaos. Kent held the throttle where it was, keeping the aircraft just above stall speed. The plane shuddered and groaned, every rivet protesting the abuse, but it held. Through his canopy he watched the enemy fighters trying to adjust, their superior speed now working against them. They'd been moving too fast to react, and now they were paying the price in wasted energy and lost position. 2 fighters attempted to loop back, pulling into steep climbing turns to bleed off speed and reposition for another attack. Kent tracked their movement with the dispassionate focus of an engineer watching a stress test. The tighter they turned, the more speed they lost. The more speed they lost, the more their own energy state collapsed toward the same vulnerable position Kent had deliberately chosen. 3 and 4 o'clock, coming around for another pass, Webb called out. Kent eased the throttle forward, just enough to maintain controlled flight. Not enough to give the enemy fighters the predictable target they needed, but enough to keep his gunners in firing position. The physics was working exactly as he'd calculated. The enemy's aggression was forcing them into unstable energy states, making them vulnerable instead of lethal. The waist guns opened up as 2 fighters dove from opposite sides, trying to catch Kent in a crossfire. But their timing was off, their speeds mismatched. One pulled out of his dive early to avoid overshooting again. The other committed fully and screamed past Kent's nose, close enough that Kent felt the turbulence from his prop wash. Cole's guns tracked the fighter as it flashed past, pouring rounds into its engine cowling. Smoke began trailing from the enemy aircraft as it peeled away, losing altitude. 1 damaged, breaking off, Cole reported, his voice steady now, locked into the rhythm of the fight. The remaining fighters were regrouping, trying to coordinate for another attack, but their formation was ragged. Kent had disrupted their energy state so completely that they were now fighting to regain the initiative they'd started with. Every second they spent repositioning was another second Kent's crew had to inflict damage. Kent watched the enemy fighters circle, calculating their next move. They were faster, more agile, better trained. But right now, in this moment, they were losing to a slower plane flown by a man who understood that physics doesn't care about aggression. The enemy fighters broke off after 12 minutes, not because they'd given up, but because they'd run low on ammunition and fuel, having burned through both trying to hit a target that refused to behave according to any logic they understood. Kent watched them peel away one by one, dark shapes disappearing into the distance, and allowed himself one slow breath before assessing the damage. The damage was catastrophic. Hydraulic fluid streamed from a severed line behind the cockpit, leaving a thin vapor trail in the aircraft's wake. The No. 2 engine was running rough, temperature gauge climbing into the red zone. Kent could hear wind screaming through holes in the fuselage, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The control surfaces responded sluggishly when he tested them, the cables probably frayed or partially severed. Damage report, Kent said into the intercom. Webb's voice came back strained. Port wing has structural damage. I can see daylight through at least 20 holes. Fuel tank on that side is leaking. Waist gun position is shredded, one of the gunners called out. Johnson took shrapnel in his shoulder but is alive. Bleeding pretty good. Cole's voice was rough. Tail section looks like someone used it for target practice. I count at least 50 holes just in my turret alone. Don't know how I'm still breathing. Kent did the math in his head. 400 miles back to base. No. 2 engine losing power. Fuel leaking. Hydraulics failing. The aircraft was flying on borrowed time and diminishing margins. We're not making it back on current fuel, Webb said, confirming what Kent already knew. Not with the leak. Kent adjusted trim, trying to find the most efficient cruise configuration. Every control input felt loose, mushy. The plane wanted to your left, fighting him constantly. He calculated fuel burn rates against distance remaining and came up with numbers that didn't work. We dropped to 8,000 feet, Kent said. Less drag, better fuel economy. Radio ahead for emergency landing clearance and medical support. The descent was a controlled nightmare. The damaged wing flexed visibly with each adjustment, metal groaning in ways that made Kent's engineering training scream warnings. The No. 2 engine finally gave up at 40 miles from base, seizing with a metallic shriek that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. Kent feathered the prop and trimmed for single-engine flight, watching the altimeter unwind steadily. The coastline appeared ahead like salvation. Kent lined up on the runway, gear down, hydraulics somehow still functioning, and brought the shredded aircraft in at 10 knots faster than normal because he didn't trust the flaps to deploy evenly. The landing was hard but controlled. The plane bounced once, settled, and rolled to a stop halfway down the runway. Kent cut the remaining engine and sat in the sudden silence, hands still gripping the controls, while emergency crews sprinted toward them. Later, mechanics would count the bullet holes. 517. The chief mechanic would shake his head and tell Kent the plane should never have made it home, that it had flown its last mile on nothing but structural integrity that existed more in theory than reality. Kent climbed out and saw his reflection in a puddle of hydraulic fluid, wire-rimmed glasses still somehow intact, face pale but composed. The math had worked. The ceremony took place 6 weeks later on a gray morning that threatened rain. Kent stood at attention while a general he'd never met read from a citation that made the mission sound cleaner than it had been, more heroic and less desperate. The words extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry felt strange applied to what had essentially been an engineering problem solved with physics. The Medal of Honor felt heavier than Kent expected when it was placed around his neck. He thought about the 517 bullet holes, about Johnson's shoulder wound that had required 3 surgeries, about how close they'd come to joining the red pins on the briefing room map. The medal wasn't for brilliance. It was for survival, which sometimes looked the same but cost more. What surprised Kent wasn't the medal. It was what happened after. Flight schools began teaching the Kent maneuver 3 months later. Not officially. Command still preferred doctrine that emphasized speed and altitude, but instructors started pulling promising cadets aside and explaining that sometimes the smartest move was the counterintuitive one. That momentum could be a weapon if you understood how to make your enemy carry too much of it. That physics didn't care about tradition or aggressive instinct. Pilots returning from combat missions reported trying variations of the throttle-down technique. Some worked, some didn't. The ones who survived understood what Kent had known from the beginning. It wasn't a magic trick you could pull at random. It required understanding energy states, calculating closure rates, reading the enemy's formation, and anticipating their response. It required thinking when instinct said to act. Webb got his navigator wings back permanently. Cole received a promotion and a transfer to training command, where he taught gunners to think about geometry instead of just pulling triggers. The rest of the crew scattered to different squadrons, carrying with them the knowledge that being overlooked by the system wasn't the same as being wrong. Kent flew 17 more missions before the war ended, each one deep into enemy territory, each one bringing back photographs that intelligence officers said changed the trajectory of strategic planning. He never lost a crew member. The other pilots stopped calling him the professor with contempt and started calling him the professor with the kind of respect reserved for people who'd proven their theories under fire. Years later, in classrooms and training manuals, flight instructors would teach cadets about pursuit curves and energy management. They'd show diagrams that looked remarkably similar to the ones Ken had sketched in his notebook during those brutal months in 1945. They'd explain that air combat wasn't just about who had the faster plane or the more aggressive pilot. Sometimes, they'd say, the smartest move is the one that looks like suicide until you understand the math. Sometimes survival requires slowing down when every instinct screams to speed up. Sometimes the bookworm who triple-checks his calculations is the one who brings everyone home alive. The lesson wasn't that intellect beat aggression. The lesson was that intellect, properly applied, could turn aggression into a disadvantage. Physics didn't care which side you were on. It only cared about the numbers. And Kent had always been very good with numbers.